Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure you're getting tired, but hopefully we'll keep you very engaged for this very exciting discussion that is going to be more conversational, not necessarily just me moderating. I'll have a few prompts, but we'll all engage. And we're really going to talk today about the exciting frontier of how we're actually translating our discoveries in longevity, in regenerative medicine, and into actual therapeutics and what that landscape looks like and where we hope to be in the next few years. With that, maybe we can just start with a very brief, quick introduction of all the speakers.
Okay, Gobel, this on? I don't think so. This one's on. How about if I just yell? I'm Dave Gobel. That's enough. CEO of Methuselah Foundation. We started 26 years ago on the area of accelerating longevity in humans. Came up with the idea of longevity escape velocity. Those of you who know that. We're still at it.
Awesome.
All right. Matt Kaeberlein. This is my second time up here today, so I'm still studying the genetics of aging for about 30 years, spent about 4 years as CEO of a healthcare technology company, currently unemployed and love it.
What are you looking for?
That is the question.
Yeah, great. And briefly, my name is Hanadie Yousef. I've also really dedicated my life to understanding aging biology and developing treatments for taking a regenerative medicine approach to rejuvenating our tissues. My career started as a graduate student in Professor Irina Convoy's lab, followed by a postdoc with Professor Tony Wise-Cray at Stanford, and then the last 9 years as the founder of a AI-driven regenerative medicine company called Juvena Therapeutics, which is developing tissue restorative biologics for chronic muscle and metabolic diseases. And I recently stepped down after 9 years from the CEO role, while in order to really spend more time looking at opportunities and ways that we can actually translate our exciting discoveries and bring them more quickly and effectively to people, looking at things from the need for better diagnostics and biomarkers through to the growth now and explosion of longevity clinics, the high increase in consumer demand, and of course, translational therapeutics. And so that brings us to the first topic. And maybe Matt, you can kind of start us off here. Tell us a little bit more about the growth of the direct to consumer, in many ways unregulated sort of Wild West now of folks really seeking now longevity treatments.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been one of the most notable features in the last 5 years or so as longevity has really exploded into the mainstream. How much of I would say the resource allocation in the space has gone into the consumer-facing market as opposed to biotech, devices, things like that. And I think that's largely because the regulatory environment is pretty non-existent in that space, and the path to revenue is much faster. And so there's a lot of good things about that. The negatives, which is what I often talk about, are that there's a lot of dishonesty. And so in particular, if you think about supplements or biological age testing or microbiome testing, these things that are not clinically validated, shown to have any particular benefits, can be sold. And so the incentive structure in that space almost makes it impossible for people who are in that space to advertise honestly. And so what you get is a lot of deceptive advertising. And so I talk a lot about the biological aging tests. That's a good example where companies have not been incentivized to actually do the statistics. Tell us, what is the replicability of these tests? What is the precision of the test? What is the accuracy of the test? Nobody knows. And so that's not useful if you believe in statistics, which as a scientist I do. But that's the situation that we have. And I think the supplement space is pretty similar. We don't know what supplement. There's a few cases, but by and large, we have no idea. And people will get up here and tell you supplement works. That's probably their opinion, but as scientists, we don't know. That's a problem.
Yeah, and there's also, of course, as we all know, this growing obsession with peptides, which is completely unregulated. We don't know which ones are safe and efficacious, as well as the dosing, as well as really the readouts needed. And you had also, in our kind of pre-conversation, talked about kind of like worrisome examples, like the first kind of wave of obesity therapeutics, like the mitochondrial uncouplers. I don't know if you know, as an example.
So I put that that's a different category in the sense that it's not really direct to consumer, but there is the other side of the space, which is unregulated therapeutics being prescribed, being used, and again, there are very competent, exceptional physicians using unregulated peptides in their practice. And many of them know how to do this. They have experience, they know how to do this. And they believe that they work for their patients. The problem, as I see it, is those of us who, again, believe in science and statistics and data, we would like to have actual high quality, rigorous data to evaluate safety and efficacy. We don't have that. The specific example, I think that I've talked about this on my shameless plug. I have a podcast, Longevity Science with Matt Kaeberlein. I have more than 3 subscribers, but I would love to have more. So please. For those of you who don't know the story of DNP or dinitrophenol, I won't take you through the whole thing. You should check it out. I have a podcast on this, but it's a really interesting parallel, I think, to what we see in some of the use of unregulated therapeutics in the longevity space today. So this is a molecule that in World War I was identified in French munitions workers because some of them died. But they lost weight before they died. And it was sort of picked up by Stanford doctors in the 1930s who started prescribing DNP for weight loss. And it's a really good weight loss drug. It's better than the GLPs. The problem is, it's also a mitochondrial uncoupler. And so one of the things that happens is when you uncouple the mitochondria, you generate heat. And there's a very narrow therapeutic window. And if you get outside of that, you die from hyperthermia. And a bunch of people die from hyperthermia. So that's actually led to the way FDA regulates drugs today. One of my concerns, though, is you now have people who are selling mitochondrial activators on the internet, and I just worry when you start mucking around with the powerhouses of the cell, things can go wrong. So I think these are the kinds of lessons that we can actually learn from what's happened in the past to think about what we're doing today.
Well, and that actually brings us to another important topic. So there's now the high consumer demand and the explosion of unregulated treatments like supplements and peptides, and our question of whether they actually work and are they safe. So we do really actually appreciate the rigorous safety metrics of, for example, bringing things through the FDA. But we know that the FDA does not treat aging as a disease. And so this brings me to a topic maybe, Steve, you can elaborate a little bit on, which is the FDA is essentially blind to underlying conditions of aging, like sarcopenia or just things that happen to all of us that might not actually have a chronic disease tag to it. So what are efforts that you and others are taking to help define better clinical endpoints, such as the understanding better the loss of resilience and frameworks such as the like TAME's basically composite measurements that we can use to educate regulatory bodies, but also begin to use so that we can actually have clear endpoints for clinical trials?
Right, right. I think the fundamental question is, if you had a drug that could slow aging, how would you know it? And really, how would you convince anyone else? You can convince yourself of just about anything. My experience in this goes back about a decade when working with Barzilai and others wanted to field a study to see if metformin could slow aging in older adults. The observational data was pretty consistent that people with type 2 diabetes who took metformin had much better outcomes across a variety of potential diseases than people taking other drugs or not taking anything. So we wanted to design a trial to show you could slow aging. And how would you do that? Well, a lot of ways to do it. most obvious way is to prevent more total mortality. That turns out to be a very expensive proposition. We did consult with the FDA at the time and proposed to them an endpoint, which is a composite, which said that if we would reduce the risk of a basket of age-related diseases, including heart disease, heart failure, some cancers, MCI and dementia, and total mortality. And would that convince them? And they said, that would be convincing. Wouldn't necessarily convince us that you slowed aging, but we would find that very interesting. And so the FDA, as we've encountered them over the years, is they're very, very interested in this area, but they would like to see evidence through randomized, rigorously done trials that some clinical disease is reduced. They're not quite convinced, as far as I can tell, that composites are going to be satisfactory, but really that's the hypothesis. The hypothesis is a composite of age-related health conditions will accrue more slowly. That's the hypothesis we're trying to test. We're trying to find common ground in the regulatory framework to see if we can design something that will have some graph.
Okay, can I ask,
Yeah.
where's TAME at? I mean, right now, is it active?
No, we have a protocol been back and forth with the FDA. It's all ready to go. We've never been able to get the funding for it. We went to NIH with it, and the reviewers of it, it's kind of interesting, basically said, well, you have to do one trial for each of the elements of the composite. We can't do the whole composite, which sort of defeated the purpose. And then we've been working with the American Federation of Aging Research to try to raise the money, and we have about a third of it raised, but are looking for the rest.
Can I ask a provocative question?
Of course. Oh, we're co-moderating. So.
Is metformin still the right choice for TAME?
I think the world of GLP-1s is really interesting in this regard. I will say, in conversations and in forums such as this, where FDA regulators are present, they put a very high value on safety. They'll put safety ahead of virtually everything else in their consideration. And one of the great, one of the nice attributes of metformin is really safe and lots of experience with it. I think GLP-1s are maybe not quite so much, but not bad in that regard. So I think if you're trying to do a prevention trial and you want the FDA to bless it, I think safety is going to end up being a very important consideration.
So that's an upfront question, right? The safety piece. I mean, are you trying about to get them to agree to let you do the trial?
Yes. If you, well, they will specify aspects of the trial design in order to say.
Yeah, right. Interesting. What about SGLT2? So again, I'm gonna plug my my podcast. You should check out my interview with Steve Austin, because I played the TAME game with him.
Yeah.
And I said, if you were doing this today, I'm $1 billion. SGLT2 inhibitor.
So
You don't have to answer that.
Yeah.
But it's interest. I think this is a question we should think about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the SGLT2 have a lot of biologic effects that are very, really show direct effect on hallmarks of aging, so very attractive in that way. I don't think they are quite as, they have more side effect profile, which is a little more concerning than the GLP-1s do.
And then, of course, there are certain age-related indications like sarcopenia, which the FDA does recognize as a particular disease of aging that we can now treat. But of course, when it comes to the regulatory hurdles of these long clinical trials and very functional endpoints that take many, many months, often with heterogeneous populations, it's very hard ultimately for a lot of companies to get the right investor commitment, funding support, and be able to kind of show efficacy. And so that brings me to maybe some other ways that we're trying to navigate this complex landscape to translate things safely and effectively to people. And so I know, for example, David, to my knowledge, Methuselah is partnered with ARPA-H on like the Prosper initiative. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how this is helping sort of bridge that gap between the need for stronger biomarkers, wearables, functional data, and metrics that companies can adopt in ultimately achieving these more personalized approaches and getting therapies approved?
So I recommend that I move back from the microphone. So I recommend that you take a look at Prosper, Prospr. I guess they couldn't afford an E. So Prosper is a 5-year program. The endpoint is designed to come up with a home-based kit that would take a little blood test and provide you and your clinician with markers, epigenetic, omics markers, that would be predictive of disease states that could be preempted. And the target price for the kit would be under $100. So it's a moonshot. They're investing, I think, $34 million. Methuselah is one of the partners, and Stanford and Buck Institute are the others. And we're going for it. So the answer to the question, well, what really works, is sometimes you crawl, walk, and hopefully in 5 years or less, we'll be able to run. How's that?
That's great. Do you think eventually, once we have these well-validated kits that have the multimodal data analysis and metrics that can be specifically tied to your, how healthy your aging is, would this be something that we can then convince regulators to adopt in various clinical trials as approvable endpoints? Because I think that is probably one of the biggest things we're struggling with in the longevity space, is how to design these affordable, short duration clinical trials that really show that these are longevity medications that could be preventative as well as treat chronic diseases of aging.
So I'm going to make a prediction that the idea of clinical trials will be relatively passé by the time 5 years elapse. They don't work. Why don't they work? Because they're ridiculously expensive, unbelievably expensive. I would estimate that there are thousands of drug and other medical patents that are just getting mulled at the patent office that would really help people, but there wasn't enough money to prove that they were right. You get one shot on goal, and if you choose the wrong shot, well, it doesn't matter if it works on many other things. You're dead. And then you now have AI, the internet, you have incredible resources, and you can get systems on private equipment, a laptop, an iPad, that will allow for what I would call virtual patient trials. A virtual patient trial basically can aggregate the anonymized information on a person's medical situation, their history, and you could source that information across entire demographics and look for all kinds of signals that are simply impossible in a trial. So I think in 5 years, we're going to look back and go, that was really stupid. It's just what we could do.
Yeah, I think there are definitely opportunities there. I guess I'm not as optimistic it'll happen that quickly, but there are clearly major problems with the way that medicines are regulated today, clinical trials are run. I think the challenge with that concept is, how do you ensure data integrity? And there's going to be data privacy issues in the United States because we're very, very, very concerned in this country about patient privacy. But my bigger concern is, how do you actually have confidence in data get.
So Matt, I'm going to interrupt you and say, we are on opposite sides of the room, and somewhere in the middle of the room will be the answer. You want everything correct, perfect, and you're right. And I want to get started now, and
The only thing I would say to this, I don't care if it's perfect. I think we need to know what's real. And so in the absence of some way to ensure data integrity, I just don't know how you do that. That's the issue. Like I don't, it doesn't have to be a perfectly, I'm totally comfortable with probabilistic, right? I've been a proponent of off-label use of medications based on probabilistic outcomes. But I think we have to have some way to actually be able to evaluate the probability of something working and understand what the actual safety and efficacy looks like. It's possible in the framework you're describing. It's just not going to be easy. And so I think that's what's going to make it take long.
see me afterwards, and I'll show you how.
Okay.
Yeah, and does that, could we potentially in a very affordable way create in many ways like a digital twin for every single human being, every, person in a country in which they have their wearable data, their blood biomarkers, whatever kind of data that they and their doctors prescribe them or they can afford, and then that's used to actually continuously measure and see if the preventative longevity treatments are moving the needle in terms of system-wide health and organ-specific health.
No, I think absolutely. But again, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen overnight. But I want to come back to the question you asked, which is, can we get to the point? Shut up, guys. But
Well, you can hear us.
it's okay. Now it's back on. Can we get to the point where, let's assume that FDA still is around in 5 years and we still have to do clinical trials. Can we get to a point where these epigenetic tests or other biomarkers can be used as surrogate endpoints for clinical trials, right? And so I think what has to happen, there's two things that have to happen. One is these things actually have to be clinically valid. So the direct-to-consumer tests are never going to reach the threshold of that because we just don't have any information on precision or accuracy. So that's going to be a no, but it is possible to do that, right? It is possible to validate these tests, actually get statistical understanding of how they're working. The other piece, though, which is harder, is how do you convince regulators that these are more than just correlations, right? In other words, an epigenetic test is an estimate of mortality risk or disease risk. How do you convince them that at an individual level, it's actually a faithful estimate? And that's harder. I don't know what it's going to take, but maybe you got probably got another idea.
Well,
but that's to me the piece that makes it hard to see how a regulatory agency is going to accept an epigenetic test or tableau, whatever, without a mechanistic connection, right?
And a function, a physical function.
So part of the issue is, are you working along with the FDA? And perhaps you've noticed that ARPA-H is a government agency and that they could collaborate and work together. The FDA is a fantastic institution, and it itself recognizes that it needs to advance into a new era. There's just no question about it. And so I'm optimistic that with working together, I mean, the FDA isn't going to accept anything that's stupid and doesn't work. But if they're taken along on the journey and they see how it's working and what the data shows, and as it emerges, and as the field advances, well, then why wouldn't they take a close look at it?
There's the FDA is very stringent in its data requirements. They've done an FDA regulated trial under IND, very strenuous, and that's good. That's a good thing. Seeing how to bring that level of rigor to the consumer interface is going to be a challenge, that one that everyone will accept. I'm going to circle back to this idea of a surrogate endpoint, which is a measure we can measure quickly after a putative beneficial intervention is given, to let us know that it will have the long-term effect that we want. FDA has approved a handful of things as surrogates. LDL cholesterol, they include blood pressure, bone density they've approved. And people have to realize what it took to get there, which were many trials showing the benefit of an intervention on, say, blood pressure for stroke, many trials, and many different ways of lowering blood pressure to all prevent stroke. And then that qualifies as a surrogate. So you don't have to do a stroke prevention trial. Antihypertensive done any was accepted. We got a long way to go because it's hard to know that we even have an effective intervention to start with, to even start to explore what putative or potential surrogates should be.
What do you think about a potential expansion of something like a conditional approval app? So,
I'm all for it. I think the situation we have right now is so conservative that it's generating the fellow panelists saying there are a lot of things that are probably beneficial that aren't getting looked at for the want of something like this.
so maybe we should just, in case not everybody knows what the conditional approval is, essentially the idea would be if you can show safety and what they call reasonable expectation of efficacy, which means probably work, might work, but you've already shown safety, then you can get conditional approval, go to market, and you have 5 years to demonstrate efficacy. That may be a middle ground where you can use a biomarker like an epigenetic test as reasonable expectation of efficacy. Still got to show safety, but then you can get something to market, accelerate timelines.
Yeah, and I think that would be game changing for some of the largest unmet needs over time associated with aging, such as age-associated muscle wasting and frailty. Right, there are no clear surrogate biomarker endpoints that can correlate, very clearly. That's very well validated with improvements in function. And so, if there was ways to get some of these really good therapeutics after showing safety, after showing improvements in maybe certain, blood sugar or muscle insulin sensitivity, things like that, I think that would definitely help companies like the one I founded to be able to get therapies that might take years to really show over time. So there's one last topic in the last few minutes I want us to cover, and that really centers around the need to fund what we like to call the valley of death for a lot of great companies and labs that have made really exciting discoveries preclinically, but either it's one of two things. Either they are struggling to get the funding needed in what we call the valley of death to kind of do the phase 1 and then phase 2, 3 efficacy studies, especially for indications where they would be first in class, which, as we know, aging or age-related diseases, many today, why we're all here, have no approved therapies and cures, or they might be considered like moonshot by your traditional investor. And so, David, I really liked when we had our one-on-one earlier, like your example about like the Johnny Appleseed analogy. How has Methuselah, please give us some examples of how you guys have sort of laid the seeds and foundation for being able to fund this type of science, from it leading to companies like tissue cryopreservation, Extherma, to NASA's attempt with bioprinting, to like epigenetic reprogramming and whatnot. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, our approach is to try to find the hole that isn't being filled, and perhaps someone as a standard VC or investor can't see how to get money from it yet. It's too risky, or maybe there's no easy path to revenue. So we started with a mouse prize, the Methuselah Mouse Prize, and that was a prize to demonstrate that extending the maximum mouse lifespan was possible. And we had 4 winners across a decade, and that cost maybe $250,000 chicken feed, but it changed the trajectory, or at least it contributed to changing the trajectory of Geroscience. We also invested, we started a micro investing fund. The fund had $2 million in it, and out of that, because of recycling, when a company was acquired or went public,
we were able to start 12 companies. And the purpose of that was to start legitimate longevity companies, but also to show a model portfolio. And the purpose of the model portfolio approach was for other investors to look at it and say, ah, that's what a longevity company looks like. And as a result, billions of dollars came in to the longevity field. Our job is not to make a lot of money. We're a nonprofit. And so, you know, there's this old Jack Benny joke. You probably don't remember him, but I'm old enough to remember him. I'm 135 years old now. A mugger comes up to him and says, your money or your life? And Jack doesn't answer. And the mugger gets impatient and says, hurry up, your money or your life? And Jack says, I'm thinking. And so I thought about it and I realized, let's make it a nonprofit. I can make money. Time, life is harder to come by. So that's, you know, the Methuselah Foundation. And that's why we're kind of optimistic. What we're doing recently is filling the hole of creating one of the first longevity clinics. It happens to be in Tyson's Corner. It's Everest Health Partners. And you can go and you can get these treatments. I was the crash test dummy for the first protocol. I had a blood pressure of 169 over 93, which was terrible. I was obese and not exactly the poster child for a longevity company or a longevity effort. So we decided, okay, we should eat our own dog food before I pass away. How embarrassing would that be? So anyway, long story short, after 6 months of rapamycin and metformin, which I'm not recommending, I'm not a doctor, I don't play one on TV, but my blood pressure went down to 120 over 73. My intraocular pressure, which, glaucoma, dropped 25%. So that's an N of 1. It's ridiculous from a scientific standpoint. But from the standpoint of me being healthy, I enjoyed it. So we thought, let's try it on a telemedicine basis. We'll ask a few people to try it out. And that led to a study that we call the Chrononauts. 50 people last year who were funded by the foundation to give it a try. It was totally voluntary and it was very successful. And we're thinking of doing it again.
Amazing. If we had more time, we'd talk more about the personalized, an N of 1 approach. Do we have time for questions? There you go. Yay.
Hi, Keith.
Raring to go. Great panel, everyone. So I have a twofold question, and it's basically, maybe I'm being reductive, but to my mind, it seems like there might be some clear approaches to speak to some of these challenges, and I'm curious if the panel can illuminate for me, like maybe why they haven't happened so far, right? So in terms of, the epigenetic clocks and, having accuracy and precision, right? I've talked to some of the creators of these clocks. It seems clear that what you'd want to do, at least as a mathematician, is, the second you have a clock like this, you'd want to do some sort of atlas study where, people are doing the test 3 times a day for a year, very like onerous perhaps to do, but, so that you can understand the technical precision and accuracy. But as I understand it, that would be like very expensive, very hard. But then why hasn't the field decided, okay, even if it costs $100 million, we need to do this. Let's do it. So that's question number 1.
There's no one in charge to make the decision. I mean, that's the honest answer.
Yeah.
Academics are not going to always have to do the thing. And in the direct-to-consumer space, they don't have to prove it. There's no reason to do it.
Yeah, so how do we create an incentive for us societally to do it, I guess is the broader question, right?
So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
And the second part question, which is somewhat related, to me, it seems that, one of the challenges with the surrogate endpoints that we're talking about, right, as you were talking about in the panel, is, if you have like a proxy of a proxy, how do you prove the mechanistic correlation, right? Where to me, it seems like the answer is sitting right there, literally in front of our eyes, by using the right combination of non-invasive diagnostics based on voice, walking gait, face, which I believe would be more than sufficient enough to at least get a deviation between chronological age and biological age. And that's a functional endpoint. Everyone knows, sit stand test and things like this. So and even in programs that I very much respect, like Prosper, I have some history with, these aspects, in my opinion, are very underrepresented when to me, it's the obvious low-hanging fruit for how we can really get some meaningful, targetable clinical indications here. So
I agree with your second, that point. I think the idea of surrogacy sort of has its specific meaning within the FDA framework, and then so that's surrogate for an FDA approved endpoint. So a lot of these things that you just mentioned are physiologic responses, but aren't a person surviving, feeling, or functioning. And it is kind of functioning, but not necessarily the way the FDA sees it. So I do think there's a path forward at that direction.
Comments on the first part?
I get that. I think just with there's actually kind of like with the earlier panel on the personalized approach and what longevity clinics are doing, there's a huge danger to trying to whittle down your, a readout to just be biological age, like what the epigenetic clocks do. And it's much more important, I think, to just really have this, more systems-wide approach to really looking at your multi-omics biomarkers, multiple blood biomarkers, and then leverage that, not to just put a random age on it, but really categorize the different aspects of how your, organs might be aging or functioning properly, and maybe have like organ-specific pieces. And so, but that would, require some sort of leadership.
We started the Biomarker of Aging Consortium when I didn't believe in it, on the idea that just because I don't believe in something doesn't mean it's wrong. So we put some seed effort and some seed money into it. And gosh, I didn't ask for it to happen, but it created an arena into which scientists could contribute their findings, and organ-specific biomarker clocks started to emerge. My guess is that none of them are any good yet, but there's an arena where they can compete and get recognition and perhaps funding. So in the absence of an arena, nobody can, vote for the gladiator, but it exists now.
Yeah, I'll finish up and just say, I think despite the fact that there are obviously many frustrations with where some of these biomarkers are at today, a ton of progress made because of initiatives like that. And so we're getting there. It's just a very chaotic time. But I think I think we are further along in being able to actually predict people's current health status, future health risks, not using biological age today than we were 5 years ago and a few years from now. So we're getting there. Just the bumpy road.
Thanks, everyone.